Bum, 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 bum. Well, welcome to Dynasty Saturday Night 5. We are a Dynasty Fantasy Football podcast from the Going for Two Live Podcast Network. Please make sure you subscribe, rate, review, follow, etc. on the Going for Two Live audio feed. Please make sure if you're watching on YouTube or other video platforms that you do all those other things that help feed the algorithm monster, like subscribing and commenting and notifications and all that. Today, we're going to be talking about rookies like we have been a lot, but with a bit of a different spin. I'm joined first by my co-host, Josh Walker. Josh, how you doing?
Doing great. I'm actually very happy to talk about some analytics and data. That's one of the reasons I love fantasy baseball. Baseball Savant is an amazing website. There's so much data on there. And I keep a tab open on Fantasy Points Data Suite. So shout out Fantasy Points. I'm actually very excited to do this episode.
I also have a tab open. Oh man, I guess Degens, but also our tab game is strong. I have 4 windows with like dozens of tabs open. It's ridiculous, but perhaps not the tab. I was going to say tab whore, but that's a little, I don't know. Perhaps the tab enthusiast that Josh and I are. Maybe we'll find out as we get to know him. We're joined by fellow Going for Two content creator, and that is Steven at Target Shares on Twitter. Steven, tell us all about where people can find you and your work and what you do at Going for Two before we get into the other stuff.
Yeah, so I guess just to talk about the tabs real quick, I think if you close out your browser and you don't panic just a little bit, then you don't have enough tabs open usually. But yeah, so Target Shares on Twitter. Last season, I'll probably do it again this season, write an article each week, which just like the 10 things that stood out analytically for me from the past week for football. And then just writing random articles now until the season kicks off. But yeah, Target Shares on Twitter.
And are you a regular on Gambit, or that's not gonna? Okay, all right. So talk about what you're doing with Gambit.
Yeah, so I think Gator J and I will be on for the NFL draft in a couple of weeks. I think the Friday night show, we'll talk about that. But in the meantime, we just did a big quarterback and running back rankings deep dive. We still have the wide receivers and tight ends to go next. So I'm kind of excited to go through those.
Sounds great. So Dynasty Gambit is a show on Going for Two, the same channel, the same network, every other Thursday?
Yep, every other Thursday.
All right. And at what time?
Except for this week or this next one because it's
the
draft.
Yeah,
but typically every other Thursday. Yeah. So 7:30.
7:30. All right. So this is got plugs, man. Plugs. Let's go. Name of the show. Time. Come on, man. Sell yourself. Oh boy. All right. You mentioned the baseball analytics, Josh. I remember us talking a little while back about how baseball was ahead of football. As far as embracing analytics and how the GMs and coaches were these 35-year-old whiz kids. And GMs and managers started to become these like 30-year-old whiz kids, and I think we're starting to see that bleed into football a little bit too, as far as that goes with front office execs and coaching staffs and things like that. Or I'm just getting old. Probably both are true. So if you're new to the show or don't remember, we use lists of 5 as a way to get into the dynasty topic that we want to talk about. Like a lot of other recent episodes, tonight's topic is, of course, the 2024 rookie class, but we'll be doing that with a bit of a different lens, through the lens of data. So before I ask Steven what he does with Skynet, Josh, what role does this types of numbers and analytics and data and stuff play in how you're developing your rookie rankings and your strategies for drafts?
To me, it's usually like a tiebreaker. If I'm like watching tape, if I'm kind of torn on 2 people, I really dive into the data, talk about ADOT, some other stuff, contested catch percentage, some other things like that, yards after catch, missed tackles forced. Those are usually just tiebreakers for me because I do like to watch film first before I look at the analytics, because I'm afraid if I look into the analytics first, I might get kind of tunnel visioned on certain things. So really it makes or breaks certain people. And we'll talk into it later, and I'll talk more about the people that we're going to. But it's usually just a tiebreaker to me to see who I like better and to really tell who I'm going to rank above somebody else.
Yeah, I think for me, it's generally the same. It's a piece of the puzzle. I do generally start with watching guys first, and to admit and to be humble, listening to people who are more trained or are more expert, more experienced at watching the film. I listen to them as well. And then I look at the numbers usually second. And yeah, it's a tiebreaker. It's a piece of puzzle. I get a little vibesy with it, and I call it like a thread in the tapestry or a piece in the mosaic and that kind of thing. But I think it can say, okay, I've seen this, but then this says this, right? Or this says this, but I've seen that, and it kind of helps you think more. I think you get a fuller picture of everybody that way. I don't advocate leaning into one over the other, but I do understand the appeal of leaning into one over the other if that's how you're comfortable. So, for example, there are just people who just they know ball, right? They got their hand in the dirt, they grind tape, and they just like that's how they can see somebody's talent, and numbers don't tell enough of the story to them, or are things that just that's not the way their brain works, right? On the other hand, I can totally understand how some people who are like, listen, I don't really know necessarily when I'm looking at film that like, oh, that tackle should have done that, and this kind of thing. I'm not really trained that way, but heck, I know numbers, and so now this is like there's no barrier to entry for me if I can make a credible model that and my p value is good and my r squared is good and we're good to go. I just I had some p value before the show. It's always valuable to get up and pee when you need to, but like for me, I always say that like film is like a texture and sensory, and data is obviously math, and those two together are the elements of what makes music, right? Sensory, texture, and math. And so for me, we make music.
Yeah,
Steve!
it's also I forgot
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
mention it's also a good during the season. You can kind of tell who's might be underperforming and who might be face to see regression. So you can buy low on certain
Yes,
people who
absolutely.
are just getting very unlucky. And you look at the data, you're like, they should be doing better, and data says they will if they just keep doing what they're doing. So it's a good way to look and see who you can buy low or even sell high on if someone's outperforming the data.
Yeah. So, like, for example, if folks may not know, like something like expected fantasy points, right? You're looking at like, oh, this guy's just having a string of bad luck. It's probably going to break soon. And so, yeah. Steven, tell us how you approach the rookie process, how you're using the data, and importantly, how you are training our AI overlords to take over the world.
Yeah, so I'd say my process is sort of the opposite of both of you. I start with the numbers. I'm not really a big college football fan. And then the film that I watch is mostly just highlights. I'm not watching a ton, I'm not grinding the tape or anything, but I do enjoy actually, once I have the numbers in front of me, watching what these guys actually look like and getting some context on top of that. And then plus listening to really smart people that actually do watch film and hearing what they think too, incorporating that. But that's not something that I'm much more comfortable with the numbers side. So I actually don't use p-values, actually doesn't come into my stuff. That's part of the reason that I do this. I use machine learning instead of like a linear regression or logistic regression. And machine learning is kind of a scary term, but it's really not that scary. Just kind of give you like some background for what it looks like. So the algorithm that I use, it's called XGBoost, just kind of a funny name. It stands for extreme gradient boosting. And the basis of it is a decision tree. So imagine a scenario where every college quarterback that averaged more than 300 yards per game was good, and everyone that didn't was bad in the NFL. That would be amazing, obviously. But the decision tree for that would basically be a point at the top and then two lines underneath it. One where over 300 yards, and then one where under 300 yards. And then the outcome would be good, bad. That's how you, like one decision tree would be working for that kind of situation. Now, XGBoost takes a ton of those decision trees, puts them all together, uses all of them to make predictions, and then it looks at a prediction in time and says, was it good or was it bad? You can see the error rate for it compared to the data that you have. And then it takes those error rates from the past and it gets better over time. So that's kind of how it works. Takes those decision trees, gives you a ton of them, and then makes predictions and then improves over time until your model is actually pretty good. That's sort of how XGBoost works. So does that make sense? Like any?
Yep.
I mean, as much as it can make sense to somebody like me, I think so. Yeah. So how far back does your data go? Because we were talking before the show that the NFL game is different now than it was 5 years ago, let alone 20, 30 years ago. So what is your data set? How far back does your data set go?
I know some people go back to 2011. I go back to 2015. And part of that, it's a tough balance between not wanting to use years that are super old because the game is changing constantly, but also machine learning models work a lot better with more data. That's sort of one of the limited downsides for applications with football, is we just don't have enough data. Like in my work stuff, I would have millions of inputs. And here we have hundreds going back to 2015. And so that is a limitation, but it's a limitation for any model that's used for football. And that's why additional context layered on top of it is so important.
I don't think I want to ask how you use machine learning for your job, because
there's nothing bad about it.
I mean, sample size is huge when you come into stuff like this, and football just doesn't have the amount of sample size you need. Because going back to baseball, 2 or 3 years of like playing 162 games, that's still for certain data sets not enough sample size to really get trends. So it does make it a little more difficult for football because there's less games, less attempts, less touches you get. So that does make it a little tough.
I think one of the benefits of using machine learning rather than like a linear regression, that like the p-value you were talking about, is one of the issues with linear regression, especially with football, is it makes this assumption, there's a fancy word, it's called multiclinearity. And that word basically just means, are your predictor variables really correlated with one another? Like, are yards and then yards after contact, what is the correlation between those variables? And we're using both to try to predict something, and they're really correlated. That breaks a lot of the underlying assumptions of linear regression, logistic regression. So I would be careful. There's a lot of models out there on Twitter. Be careful of your favorite one, just in case if they're not transparent with how they build it. I would be wary that would be something that's probably built into their process that maybe they don't even know. But that is a bad sign.
Okay. Are there any out there in particular? Not that not naming somebody is disrespecting them or something like that, but any that come to mind, like any of the numbers nerds that like you love, especially to follow on Twitter, that people like me or anybody watching or listening may not be following at the moment?
Yeah. One of my favorites is JJ Zachariason. I think everyone already knows him though. But I think his model is different than the stuff that I do, but it's always nice when you come to a similar conclusion on a player when different processes too. But I haven't really seen a lot of people, at least, and I'm sure people can correct me, that use machine learning in the space or do something that I see. And I also don't see a ton of transparency, like someone put out, say, here's my model, and they won't really go into how it's built, which I guess I try to do with my stuff, like show you how it's built and what's being used. And, because again, I think we were talking before the show too, that I would hesitate to just use the model. This is the rankings that spit out, and then you're done. Those are my wide receiver rankings. I don't do that. And I think most people don't do that. Like JJ Zachariason doesn't do that. He has his model, but then layers additional context on top of it. So I think you can't just use the numbers that spit out and then call those your rankings.
No, that's fair. All right. So before we move on, let's pay some bills. The show, as usual, is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Underdog has it all. Pick'ems, DFS, big board, little board, best ball. They've got other major sports besides football, baseball, golf, hockey, basketball, racing, and stuff. Why am I talking about this? Well, if you go to underdog.com or the Underdog app and use our promo code GF2, you can get up to $100 off on your first deposit if you are a new account. So please make sure you go ahead and do that. And we have a nice little shiny, sparkly QR code here on the screen. If you're watching on one of our video platforms, go to underdog.com or the Underdog app and make sure that you use promo code GF2. Get that $100 deposit match. If you deposit $2, you get $2. If you deposit $101 or more, you get $100. You know how it works, but it's coming right out of Josh Norris's pocket. So let's make sure we all do that. All right. So time to get into our list of 5. Steven has come to us with 5 topics that he wants to talk about related to the AI overlords and the 2024 rookie class. So take it away, go in whatever order you want. What's the first topic you want to talk about?
Okay. Yeah. So doing my wide receiver prospect modeling, I found that average depth of target was pretty important. And I think you find this bucket where you would ideally want your wide receiver to have an ADOT between 10 and 14 yards in their final season. That's sort of like the sweet spot. Just for context, historically, a wide receiver with that 10 to 14 yard range, they outscore their peers by about 3.5 fantasy points per game in the NFL. If they have an ADOT that's over 14 yards, and then it's 2.5 more fantasy points for guys that have an ADOT under 10 yards. So you want to be in that 10 to 14 range, and that guys in that range are typically about 3 fantasy points per game better than the guys that are outside of that range. So wide receivers. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
No, please keep going.
So for wide receivers drafted in the first 3 rounds, I think Malachi Corley in that under 10-yard bucket is really interesting to me. So he's all the way up to pick 52 in the NFL mock draft database, which seemed pretty high to me. I was surprised when I saw that. And my modeling stuff doesn't really hate him. He's got really good efficiency, like yards per route run, targets per route run. And he's got really great yak. That's sort of what he's known for. But with that additional context, that his final season ADOT was 5.8 yards. So way below that 10-yard number. That's 3rd percentile since 2015. It's really, really low. And kind of Adam Humphries is the only guy sort of in that range that's kind of a hit. But it's not really a great name if you want to take him early in a rookie draft. So just kind of curious what you guys think of Corley. Do you think his game can actually translate to the NFL, or is he just like a Rondale Moore kind of gadget-esque guy?
Josh, you can go first.
He was getting a lot of hype coming out of the Senior Bowl and before the Combine. Someone who I see on the list there, I'd much rather take a shot on Malik Washington. Everyone was kind of comparing Malachi Corley to like a Debo type player, but he wasn't even. I think Malik Washington's has better yak skills, and I'm honestly not. I'm not buying into Malachi Corley. I can fairly certainly say I won't draft him in any rookie drafts unless it's like late 3rd, early 4th, where it just really doesn't matter at that point.
Yeah.
I'm a little sunnier on him than Josh seems to be. I definitely do have that ADOT concern, right? And I do understand the sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone, right? You don't want your wide receiver to have too low an ADOT or too high an ADOT, right? Because too high, they're just a situational deep threat, and too low, they can be gadgety and they have to get their touches schemed and manufactured. And I get that. And I get that Corley, is playing at Western Kentucky, right? And that's in Conference USA. And so, that's a factor as well. So I have a big tier of 12 to 20, and 12 to 16 is kind of like the top half of that tier, where there's a mix of guys where I'm like, listen, if they land in the right spot or they're used correctly, they could have bigger ceiling than the guys below them. Corley is at the bottom of that top half of the tier for me. He's 16 overall, 2 spots below Malik Washington. But if you ask me, like, what does my heart feel? My heart feels much more in line with Malik than I do Corley. I see a world in which Corley can translate, that he lands on a team that can scheme him open, that uses him well. It's a game where you get your best playmakers the ball in space. He's a former running back. We see that, with all the yak and broken tackles and that sort of thing. But I also see a world in which he's kind of a bust, and he's another Rondale Moore. In fact, we joke about the Debo thing and Rondale Moore. I was retweeting some Senior Bowl measurements and stuff like that, and one of the things I said about Malachi Corley is, like, it seems like he has next Rondale Moore or next Debo Samuel within his range of outcomes. And I truly think, like maybe not specifically those guys, but the outcome is the range of outcomes for me. I see it as that wide, right? And so, but I don't think it's the type of wide range of outcomes, high variance player that I lean into the ceiling part that I might with someone like, say, I think Brian Thomas is a volatile guy. I think people are a little too high on him, but I'm willing to lean into him more than I'm willing to lean into somebody like Malachi Corley or a couple of these high ADOT guys that you might talk about.
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually do like Malik Washington a good amount more than Corley. His ADOT's it's still below 10, but it's 8.1, so it's not quite as extreme as it was for Corley. And then you also have some other stats that you really like with Washington too. Is PFF grade. It was really fantastic. I think it was like second in the class, behind only Neighbors. Really strong like tackle evasion and efficiency too. But yeah, on the higher side, I think AD Mitchell is the biggest guy that's concerning for me, especially given the context of where you would have to take him in your rookie draft, where he's going to get drafted in the NFL draft too. And it's not the only concern with him. I mean, his yards per out run, targets per out run, both bad, kind of average at tackle avoidance, kind of average PFF grade. And I think a lot of the reason that I'm down on some of these like really big combine guys is I don't use any of the combine stats in my stuff. And part of that is selfish because I want as much data as possible that I can use. And with guys opting out and not testing, that makes it more difficult to fill in all of those blank spots in the variables that you use in the model. And also, I think a lot of the combine results are overblown. I think like a 40 time, for example, it's much more correlated with where a player will get drafted in the NFL draft than their actual production. And then you can use stats in a different way to get like a proxy for athleticism too. If you can get like missed tackles forced, I think you can use that as a proxy for athleticism as well. So, but yeah, AD Mitchell, Josh, I think we were joking that you mentioned that like, what does Braylon Allen do that Audric Esme doesn't? Like, what does AD Mitchell do that Javon Baker doesn't? I think that's my big advice with him is if you're on a rookie draft and you want to click the button on AD Mitchell, just stop, trade back, and then take Baker later. And I think you're going to, win out most of the time.
It's funny. Baker and Burton, Burton and Baker are at the very top of that big tier that I talked about.
I like both those guys.
I technically have Mitchell ahead of them at 10. But that's really because I bake into my rankings sort of expected draft capital and like where are you going to see them fall in a fantasy in a rookie draft and that sort of thing. I think later on, maybe closer to the draft, we might talk a little bit about like, okay, these are our rankings, but like let's add some nuance to it, like at cost and who's a value and who's at the back of a tier that you like better and that sort of thing. So yeah, AD Mitchell to me, he's a guy that I'm trusting Brian Thomas and Troy Franklin as far as these outside guys who could miss. Not that they're the same player, but like, at more than I'm trusting AD Mitchell, Keon Coleman, and Devontae Walker. AD Mitchell here, the ADOTs that I have are 15, 15.2, and 16.0 in the 3 seasons he played in Texas. The Ewers factor, the Quinn Ewers factor has to be in there somewhere, like I kind of feel like a fraud because I'm like, I will use the Ewers factor to help Worthy more than I will to help Mitchell. So I get that. I get like where that, but I really do believe that Xavier Worthy is a much better, more versatile, more high-end electric dynamic player than AD Mitchell. AD Mitchell's ceiling for me is like George Pickens. And I don't know that that's something I'm very excited about. George Pickens is George Pickens. He's okay. I'm lower on him than a lot of other people, but he's, looks to be a perennial wide receiver 3 as far as fantasy goes, 24 to 36, 25, 36 or whatever, than he does anything else. And I don't know that I want to spend that capital on Mitchell. It's a tough click. But I see how it can work. There are people who love him, and I hear their arguments. Trevor Sikkema from PFF loves Corley, loves Mitchell. Like, I get the arguments. I can see it, and that's what's so much fun about rookie season. Josh, where are you on Mitchell?
Yeah, if I can't trade back, if I'm either into the first, early second, if I can't trade back, I'd rather take a guy like Ladd, Pearsall, maybe even Jonathan Brooks if you're just really running back needy. But yeah, I think the best move if you're at the end of the first, and like obviously I'll take Franklin over him. I've seen Franklin in a lot of mocks recently fall into the second round. I'd much rather have Franklin over AD Mitchell. So yeah, I won't be drafting AD Mitchell because I just know he's never going to fall to a point where I feel safe doing that, kind of like Pickens did. And I'm okay with that. I can, if he does good, I can bite the bullet and say, well, I missed on that one. But usually that profile doesn't work out. It might work out, but it doesn't return the value you spent in the rookie draft.
Yeah, I'm not saying like AD Mitchell's going to be these guys, but when we talk about this new era of the NFL, the misses that we're getting in these dynasty rookie drafts are more like players like AD Mitchell than they are otherwise, right? They're the big, fast, athletic guys, mostly on the outside, boundary guys who have a high variance, and they end up being more misses than hits. And I think we need to kind of learn our lesson from N'Keal Harry and Jalen Rieger and Josh Doxson and Kevin White and Terrace Marshall and and just kind of say, well, okay, you may be useful for an NFL offense and have a few good plays for best ball, but you might not be the guy I want on my week-to-week dynasty team. Before we move on to the next topic, Jamie has a question here about PPR versus non-PPR. Like, does the model say, this, like, do you have could you run something that says, run a machine learning thing for PPR versus like half PPR and standard?
You could. So what it does is it takes the average of the first 3 NFL seasons in fantasy points per game of all the guys that have already happened. That's your kind of like training data set. That's how they call it in machine learning. You have training and test, and then you have validation as well. But what I'm training it on is PPR points. And so what the model is attempting to do is predict how many PPR points on average in the first 3 NFL seasons that this prospect class will score. And if you change the training data set to be non-PPR instead, well, then it would adjust the model and try to predict the non-PPR points for these guys. So the answer is yes, you can. It would just be a different model. Mine is PPR, but it'd be pretty easy to change it to non-PPR if you wanted to.
Is there a way to train a machine to give me validation? Because I might need that.
Yes,
lately.
I think so, probably.
Okay. All right.
I think that's more on the AI chatbot side, which is what I work with. You can train them to be very empathetic, and that's what I do for a living is train AI chatbots.
Yeah.
So that's more what you should go for.
I think so, though, Brian.
Okay, I have good experience with bots. All right, what's the next topic that you want to talk about with
this one's a little less intuitive, I think, and this one's still difficult for me to explain, but so it's wide receiver career slot rate. It is the average slot rate for these wide receivers over their college careers. And what I found is similar to ADOTS, there's a bucket in the middle, but this time you don't want to be in that middle bucket. The middle bucket's bad, whereas the middle bucket for ADOT was good. But what I found is players with a career slot rate between 33 and 53%, they tend to underperform relative to their peers. And I'm trying to think of a reason for that. I mean, it's pretty clear when you look at it that the names that fall into that bucket are not the guys that you want your rookies to mirror. I guess I kind of thought initially that you'd want your wide receiver to have that flexibility to be able to play in the slot, play on the outside. But I do wonder if there's something there that, like, if you're talented enough, your college coach will put you in the role. You will beat out anyone else to be in that spot more frequently than not. I don't know, but it's a weird like middle bucket here for career slot rates that tend to be pretty bad. Like names, for example, Nelson Aguilar, Sterling Shepard. These are like the hits. Tyler Boyd, Terrace Marshall, Andy Isabella, Anthony Schwartz. Like it's not a good list of names. It's not where you want to be. This year, the 2 guys that pop up, and really the one guy that's the most interesting is Ladd McConkey. I thought it was interesting that he popped up there. He's going to have a lot better draft capital than most of these guys. And again, this is just one variable, and Ladd shines in a lot of stuff and doesn't shine in some other stuff too. He's sort of an interesting profile, but I think he's definitely the most interesting guy that lands in this bucket. I guess, Brian, like I know you wrote the article for Going for 2 on Ladd. I'm curious what you think of him. Like, to me, he is super efficient, and not that he is Puka, but his profile is kind of similar where on the routes he was in, he's crazy efficient. His yards per route run is fantastic. He just didn't have a ton of routes. And part of that, I'm sure, is injury, but part of that is like, why was he not on the field more, I guess?
Yeah, I went into it a little bit more in the article, and also linked to a couple other videos and stuff that talk about it. I think the short version is run heavy offense, crowded, as far as pass catchers. I mean, you've got Brock Bowers contributing to a national championship team as a 19-year-old freshman. Like, that's who you're competing with, right? And also the score, like they're always in the lead. So game script, would also dictate that as well. I'm a Ladd truther, to an extent. I have his career slot rate as 29.6%. So I mean, whatever, it's a few snaps off, but it would put him in a safer bucket. I think the reason that I might be more optimistic about his landing in this bucket, the bad bucket, is I think he's going to have a higher slot rate in the NFL.
Yep.
Like a lot of people are saying he can win outside. He's not just a slot guy, and I get that. People are trying to not put him in that lunch pail gym rat white guy slot. Like I get that, right? Yeah, and he did show prowess on the outside. I think he can be a Z flanker, but I think it's going to matter week to week, matchup to matchup, how much you're going to ask him to win outside. Because I believe, while I think his play strength and athleticism and things like that are good for the NFL level, I don't know that they're going to be good enough to consistently beat guys on the outside with some of these bigger corners and things like that, or that a certain matchup. So I think the slot rate will go up, and that's why maybe, just to your one point about the slot rate bucket, I'm a little more optimistic. Yeah, Josh, you like Ladd too, right?
Yeah, I like him. I lowered him just a little bit in my rankings because the main reason I listened to Matt Waldman talk about him. He's a little lower on him than consensus, and he actually has, which confirms my prior. I had Pearsall above Ladd, and I still do, and he confirmed that. And I was curious, Steven, where Pearsall was in the slot, because I think he played a lot of slot, and I like him in the NFL as a big slot receiver who can stretch the middle of the defense, and that's one of the reasons he's better at ball tracking and making contested catches than Ladd is, and that's one reason I like him a little bit more, because I think that's a dynamic skill in the NFL to be able to do that.
Yeah, at Pearsall, I have Pearsall just above that range, so just above the bad range, and so these are tough. They kind of like Brian said, I think different data sources might be slightly different as well, and being just above the range for this is good, but also you're pretty close. But my modeling stuff, Brian and I were talking about it briefly before the show. It really likes Ricky Pearsall. I'm kind of surprised that I don't use any of the combine stuff, and he really showed out at the combine. So I am surprised that my stuff is higher on Ricky Pearsall than consensus, because I don't care about the combine at all, and anyone who would care about the combine would boost him up because of that. So I think people are
and
Pearsall.
College quarterbacks, I think, need to be taken into context, because Pearsall did have Anthony Richardson, but then last year I don't even know who their quarterback was. I watched a few games; they didn't look good, and I think that does need to be taken into it, because Carson Beck wasn't great, but he was fine for Georgia. He's a pretty accurate passer. He's a solid quarterback. So I guess you kind of got to bake that into. But I have him 8-9, so it's not like I'm way lower on the other. I have Ladd one spot behind Pearsall. So.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that I'm like the high man on Ladd. I think I have him at 5 actually now. Yeah, he's in a tier with Worthy and Thomas and Troy Franklin.
I have him at 7.
I love him. I think, because I'm baking into this, I think the idea that he's going to be more slot, and that he's got the type of skills that the NFL rewards a lot more these days. But I mean, obviously, I'm not going to say that I know better than Matt Waldman, right? He's got Drake May, quarterback 6, right? That's why I love rookie season, because I'll read his stuff and be like, oh yeah, I can see that. Or I'll listen to him on a podcast, but oh yeah, I can see that. And it's a matter of, I think, what part of the game do you think will be more beneficial, more dangerous for a certain prospect? And we can see the player in somewhat similar fashion, but just have him different in the rankings, especially because I think, Matt's pre-draft stuff is very much, I think, leans in the direction of it's a talent evaluation and not what I'm doing with my fantasy rankings, which is definitely
predicting.
But
kind of.
Yeah.
And one more little point to Ladd. I worked in a brewery in Athens, Georgia during football season, so I had every football game on every Saturday I worked. He was not healthy. A lot of games he even played, he wasn't 100% healthy, so he'd come in on big snaps where they needed a big first down, and he came through then, but he really wasn't on the field a lot, and I think that was mostly due to health and game script, everything else. Why put him out there if we're up by 30 points,
Yeah.
I think Ladd is really interesting with the modeling stuff. I bet if you can see where an analyst is on Ladd with their data stuff, I can kind of tell you that they're baking in more career production numbers, or they're baking in more per route efficiency stuff. Like I think Lad's sort of telling of the model of that someone's using is, okay, did they care more about this or that? And Lad is just such an interesting guy that like where you would have him, I think says a lot about your process.
I want to read something to you about that, but hold on. It's going to take me just a couple seconds here to Command F this PDF here. It's really weird stat about Lad McConkey. Okay, McConkey's best season 3.26 yards per route run is 6th highest in this year's class. Of the players who come in higher, each one had a receiving yards per team pass attempt rate north of 3.3, except for McConkey, who was at 1.63. Yeah, and that's from JJ Zacharyason's guide, late round, rookie guide, which y'all should get. So, right, like which Lad is it?
And I think it's those two variables are really correlated with each other. A correlation, coefficient of north of like 0.85 or something, but they're not for Lad. Like most of those guys are really, really connected, except for Lad, and then except for, and I'm not saying he's Puka, but except for Puka last year. These are two guys that are really different in those two marks, whereas most people are really, really similar. And so, like, which one?
You heard it here first.
Lad is
Puka. You have Taj Washington in this bucket as well, in the bad bucket. I know some folks who are really in on him, and I know some folks who are fading him as far as like he's between 25 and 30. I think I have him at like 21 or something like that. I can see it both ways. What are your general thoughts on Taj?
I think given the draft capital too, it's not someone that I've really spent a lot of time digging into. I feel like he's not a guy that I think is probably worthwhile unless it's like the 5th round of a rookie draft to take. Because draft capital for all positions is really important, wide receiver included. And I just don't think he's going to get very good draft capital either. So it's definitely a guy that like, I don't know. I don't think I have him ranked, but if I did, it would be pretty late.
And you have expected draft capital baked into the numbers right now, right?
I do, yeah, because it's so important for every position. And then maybe we'll get to quarterbacks as my 5th point, but like especially for quarterbacks, because the modeling for quarterback is it's really tough. And so draft capital as it's called model gain for XGBoost. You can like run something called like there's partial dependence plots, which I won't have to get into that deeply, but they kind of show like based off of like the draft capital for a player, like where are the marks that are kind of important. Like for running backs, you really want your guy to be drafted in the first 100 picks. And there's a pretty big drop off after that. But that draft capital component for quarterbacks is the most important of any position because the other variables, we just don't have a really good sense of what we should be using for those for quarterbacks. But it's such I think it's part of
quarterback's the closest thing we have to a crapshoot.
Yeah, like the reason JJ Zacharyson doesn't even put out quarterback stuff for his doesn't have quarterback model, and I think it's rightfully so because I can't find anything that's very good either.
Yeah. So here's your homework with the running back stuff. Disaggregate that between overall and before the last couple of years and the last couple of years. My hypothesis is that guys that are a little bit after 100 are going to be a little bit better in the model than they used to be, simply because the shifting draft capital for the position is going down. But
I think it's so tough because you want to be able to use as much data as possible, but also, like you said, things are changing constantly in the NFL, and one of those is where running backs are getting drafted. And so it's really difficult to be able to, because you want to use as many years of data as possible to train it, but then you don't even have the results of the last couple of years.
So you're not even using guys who haven't had their first 3 seasons yet, right? So we even have to wait for that data to, Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And you can kind of like qualitatively use it if you want to and take a look at it. But ideally you would want to give the guy 3 full years because that's what you're trying to predict is the average points per game over his first 3 seasons. So guys in the last draft class, I'm not using, but guys in the draft class before, I am deciding to use with 2 years. It's probably enough to get a sense of it. just to try to add more data in. But yeah, it's definitely kind of like qualitative on that.
All right. What is your next fun machine learning AI overlords take that we're going to be talking about?
Yeah. So running backs. For me, there's like sort of three things that matter. In addition to draft capital, obviously it's important, but of the three non-draft capital things, it's like, are they a good runner? And I see that through their PFF career run grade. Are they a productive receiver, as seen their really through career routes and also receiving yards per game? And then the third bucket is like, do they have juice? Do they have tackle evasion? What's their elusive rating like? Those are kind of the three buckets. And there's only 6 running backs that I see in this class that will get decent draft capital and check at least 2 of those boxes. So it's Jonathan Brooks, Trey Benson, Bucky Irving, Jalen Wright, Aldrick Estime, and Marshawn Lloyd. So those are kind of like the 6 running backs I care about at all. And they do not include Blake Corum or Braylon Allen. I know 2 running backs that a lot of guys really like. But of that list, I really think Estime is probably the most interesting one. I think Bucky's really interesting too. But because I'm not using any of the combine stuff, Aldrick Estime is getting knocked a ton for his 40 time. That did improve during his pro day. I don't know if people are really incorporating that. Pro day stuff is hard to incorporate too. But yeah, my stuff really likes Aldrick Estime. But curious if you guys have knocked him down since the combine, or just generally how you use combine stuff for your processes.
Josh, take this one.
Yeah, just to be frank, I do not give a shit about 40 time when it comes to running backs. Like, I really don't, because game speed is completely different. Like, Isaac Guerrero had the same exact game speed as Aldrick Estime clock during the game. So he also ran like a 4.3, and it's getting way too overhyped in my opinion. So I really don't care about that. I more pay attention to bursts, like some of the broad jump, the 10 split, and some of these other things that show actual explosiveness. And like you said, I've said it 100 times on the show, Estime is the perfect perfect blend of size and quickness and agility, and also speed. Like, his breakaway run rate was really high.
Yeah. And
for someone to run a 4.7, like, that shouldn't happen. So that's just, it doesn't matter. And those 6 running backs you had are 6 of my top 7 that I have in the top tier. I do have Corum in there at the end of it, but because I think he's going to translate pretty well, but I like that. And according to PFF, I'll send you the link after this, Steven, the Costanza model for hand size, Aldrick Estime is in the 98th percentile for that, and that apparently translates really well to the NFL. So
it's funny, man. Hand size correlates. How about that? Yeah,
AD Mitchell's only in the 21st percentile of that. So
there you go. It's over. It's over for Mitchell. Knock him down. Adjust the ranks. I tend to be aligned with Josh when it comes to Estime, although have him a couple notches below in the rankings. He didn't really move with the combine stuff for me because he was kind of in that 6, 7, 8 range anyway.
Yeah.
I think I'm not going to say that I don't care about the 40. Like, I care about absolutely anything and everything on the planet. I'll pick through the guy's poop if I think it'll give me an advantage in a rookie draft. But it does plug into things like height adjusted speed score. Or weighted for running backs, weight adjusted speed score, which I think, can matter. And I think it's a data point that I want to collect to know a little bit about them. But yeah, I think this is what I'll do with some of that stuff is kind of what Josh was talking about, where, you'll see this big guy like Guerrero who has a 4.3. And I was like, did he switch bodies with his teammate, Jawar Jordan? He's supposed to be the 4.3 guy. And then Jordan ran a 4.5 or whatever. So I look at that and say, okay, you're big, you're fast. Why were you sitting behind Chaz Malusi and Braylon Allen? Why were you splitting carries with slower, smaller Jawar Jordan at Louisville? Like, that tells me that there's something else that's like, you're maybe not that great at football. Now, again, with the caveat of these guys are young kids and they can beat the crap out of me and run around better than I can.
And
so
can improve
it feels
well.
The older I get, the weirder it feels to be like, you're not good at football. I mean, like, all right, buddy. Yeah, all right. Get on your couch. And
this guy's terrible as I sit here and drink my 4th Diet Coke of the day. Or something, that's fucking boring. He's not athletic. What are we doing?
So, with that grade, I'm gonna take on Bucky here. Because I'm a Bucky defender. I do think that the testing for me shows that his path is probably narrower, and that some of his success might be based on going against Pac-12 defenses and being in a Pac-12 offense. But I do think he's agile, he's productive. You get him in space, he'll work well. So I think he's a guy that in the right situation. But I did knock him for sure. But in Bucky's defense, I'm going to bring up a tweet here from Dynasty Zoltan, who does, I think, a great job of blending film and numbers in his rookie stuff and in sticking to like his guns with stuff. Since 2018, 5 running backs have had a 15% or greater explosive rush rate, 3.5 plus yards after contact per attempt, and 90 plus receptions. Those 5 are Travis Etienne, Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Tony Pollard, and Bucky Irving. So something to think about, when we think about the difference between numbers, athleticism, and being good at football. Hashtag Kyron Williams.
Yeah. We were talking about Bucky on the Gambit, and I kind of said, if you could have access to a genie and you could give one of these prospects like elite size and speed, I think it would be Bucky for me, because he flashes on everything else that I care about. But he's small and slow relative to his weight. But if you could give him like elite size and speed, then this guy would be an unbelievable prospect. So I'm willing to bet on him, even if the range of outcomes is pretty poor potentially, because like pretty much only Kyron has hit from a guy that's sort of like his size and speed, and so you can't just rely on one. But I guess I'm on the Bucky defender list as well. I didn't realize there was like a club.
I mean, he had a better 10 split than Jalen Wright, Marshawn Lloyd, Blake Corum, Audric Estime, Ray Davis, Isaiah Davis, let's see, Schrader, Garendo, Dylan Johnson. Like 10 splits kind of matter, for running backs. I think, especially like that's a few yards before the line of scrimmage and a few yards after. And I think his 10 split historically is right in line with Breece Hall. I mean, again, I'm not saying he's Breece Hall. I'm saying you can't just look at a 40 time and just miss somebody. Yeah, exactly. Bucky, there you go. Yeah, we'll have to get the timestamps for Ladd and Puka. Bucky is Breece, and Estime is Jerome Bettis. So yeah, there you go.
Hey, same school.
Yeah, exactly. What is the next topic you want to talk about?
So tight ends that aren't Brock Bowers. I think I've heard a lot.
No, I'm kidding. I love talking about them, but yeah. But
I think I've seen kind of a wild range of rankings for all of these guys. Not everyone has like Jatavian Sanders as their 2. Like some people really like Kate Stover. That's their 2. As we'll talk about, I really like Jaheim Bell, even though the odds of him actually hitting are pretty small. But for like day 3 tight ends, I found 2 things that were kind of interesting. Like for context, day 3 tight ends don't score very many fantasy points, so the numbers aren't going to be very high. But day 3 tight ends, if they have a yak per reception over 6.5 yards, so like they get 6.5 more yards after a catch or more in their final season, they score about 1 more fantasy point per game than the guys that don't hit that. And then similarly, there's day 3 tight ends. If they avoid more than 1 tackle per 5 receptions, they score about 1.5 more fantasy points per game than the other group. And in this class, Cade Stover, Jaheim Bell, and Ben Sinnott, those are the 3 guys that are going to be drafted late that hit both things. Jaheim Bell's the guy that I like the most of them. I mean, you can't get too over your skis on a guy that's going to drafted in like the 5th or 6th round. Like he's probably not going to hit. And he's my height, so he's pretty small for a tight end. And he's more of like a tweener type guy. But good PFF grade, good yards per out run, targets per out run, elite tackle avoidance, kind of like I mentioned. Just curious, of those 3, do you guys like any of them? Any chance for Jaheim Bell that you think he could actually translate, or is he just like an H-back in the NFL?
For me, Bell seems like undersized and positionless and an H-back, but who knows, right? Like he could surprise me. I think the other 2 guys are guys I like better. I'm like the conductor of the Ben Sinnott hype train. He's my tight end too. I love the guy. I do think people are sleeping on Cade Stover though. Like I think he's a classic example of when you look at like the backstory, right, of a guy who who came to Ohio State as a linebacker, and even when he switched to tight end because of injuries, had to play linebacker in a couple games, And when you think about college use of a tight end, especially Ohio State use of a tight end, you have to take that into context. So I do think people are sleeping on him. I have another guy to ask you about that I'm curious about, but Josh, what do you think about these guys?
Out of those three, I like Sanat. I like Sanat the best. I have him at, like you said, tight end 2. I have Theo Johnson at 3. I just really like his explosiveness and speed, and I think landing spot's going to be very dependent for him. I was higher on Cade Stover until I started looking into Ohio State tight ends and how they really translate to the NFL. And I just think he's going to be more of a blocker. Like, he can break some tackles. I do like the way he avoids tackles and breaks them, but I'm just afraid it's going to be such a low ceiling and kind of a low floor too, that he's just going to be a tight end 2 that blocks more than he does run routes. Like you said, I think Jaheim Bell is just a little small, but if I'm sitting there in like end of the 4th and Sanat and Johnson are gone, or even 5th round, I'll take a shot on him because the NFL is changing. Size for especially receivers doesn't matter as much. So maybe the tight end's starting to trend that way too.
Because the mock draft we most recently did for you guys, I took Jaheim Bell in the 5th. So that's a guy, like, if I have a 5th round pick, I'm willing to
I'm fine with that
and see if, like, maybe he turns into something. I don't know, but I really like him.
Yeah. At that point, it doesn't cost you if it doesn't work.
It's free. Yeah, basically.
Curious what you found on Jared Wiley and or Eric All, if you've run anything with them.
So I really wanted to talk about Eric All. He just misses both of these, I think, if I remember correctly. My modeling stuff really likes Eric All a lot. I don't know a ton about him, to be honest, but in terms of like expected fantasy points per game, he shows up as tight end 4. Again, I don't have that as my ranking, I don't think, if I was going to rank them, but he shows up pretty high. I think that's only behind Stover, Bowers, obviously, and Sanders. He would be 4 in terms of just the model's expectation for fantasy points. So I was surprised by All. He just misses these 2 kind of metrics that we talked about. He's close. So yeah, I like All a lot.
Yeah, I think he's a guy who's underrated, but I think, like you said, it's going to be available unless we get some surprise on draft day.
Yep.
5th round post-draft waivers, so somebody to keep an eye on. All right. Oakley dokley. What is your 5th and final topic that you want to talk about?
Getting to quarterbacks, there's been a lot, and I'm glad people are talking about it on pressure to sack rate for quarterbacks.
That's this year's thing, right? Yeah.
Which, I mean, if you would have told me that in the middle of the season last year, I would have been pretty excited about it, because I talked about it a lot with Fields and Sam Howell during the season. A lot of my articles kind of brought that up, and it is one of the few stats that is pretty sticky from college to the pros for quarterbacks. If a guy has a pretty bad or pretty good pressure to sack rate in college, that tends to translate to the NFL as well. It is kind of surprising. It feels a little overblown now, which is kind of feels weird for me to be the one that's kind of like fighting against it when I was talking about it a ton. But like, for context, it's for quarterbacks, and the model's not very good for quarterbacks, but it's the 10th most predictive variable, or it adds the 10th most gain to the model. So it's 10. It's pretty low down on the list. And Jaden Daniels gets a ton of flack for his pressure to sack rate. And I think some of it's justified, but I think, kind of like we were talking about before, where it's important to be humble, especially with quarterbacks, because we're really bad at predicting how many points they're going to have, fantasy points, and how good they're going to be in the NFL too. So Daniels, yeah, he's in bad company, but if you filter for players that have like pretty good draft capital, a high scramble rate, and then a poor career pressure to sack rate, where Daniels is in that list, and then you just look at guys that improved from their second to last season in college to their final season in college. So like, they got better. It's just Joe Burrow and him. Those are the only 2 guys that fit those criteria. Not to say that he's going to be Joe Burrow, but it is, I think, some room for optimism and hope with Daniels, is that he got a lot better before his final season there. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And his rate was also better than Caleb Williams was in 2023. So I don't think, like, you can't just say that and like, oh, because he has a career pressure to sack rate that is bad, he's going to be like these other bad players. I think there's a lot. You can add some additional more context on top of that, and try to stay humble with the quarterback predictions, because we're really bad at it.
Yeah. I mean, so much stuff goes into quarterbacks, like what's between the ears, and scheme and fit and coaching, and the supporting cast and weapons and all that. So, I mean, there's like, but this seems to be, a sticky one way or the other. The thing with, so are you saying that like it's important, but we're probably overblowing it if we're gonna, use it the way that it's kind of being talked about out there on Twitter these days?
Yeah, I think it's something that is sticky year to year, but it's not necessarily predictive of fantasy points, which is what I'm trying to predict.
Right.
in
Okay.
the
I got
NFL.
you. Yeah.
Like yes, it translates, but also you can't just use that to say that a player is good or a player isn't going to score fantasy points in the NFL. Like it's not very useful for determining that on its own. And then even in the context of a model, it's 10th most important in a model that is objectively not great, because I haven't seen a model for quarterbacks yet that is very good. So
No.
I think it's surprisingly been overblown. Yeah. And it's just kind of funny that it went from like no one was talking about it and now tons of people are talking about it. But I think we kind of jumped the shark a little bit, in my opinion, from what I've seen.
Penix has a low pressure to sack rate, and he's praised for that.
Extremely
I'm gonna
low.
go
Like
against Matt
99th
Waldman.
percentile.
Yeah, I'm gonna go against Matt Waldman here again. But I think what I see with Penix is one of the reasons that sack rate is so low is that pressure to sack rate is low, is that he gets rid of the ball almost at the first sign of pressure. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. There are some things on tape where he does, shift a little bit or climb the pocket. But for me, I don't want a quarterback giving up on the play that quickly, and I think that feeds his pressure to sack rate. So I think beyond jumping the shark, we also need to look at like the numbers, like what's behind the numbers, and say, guys like Daniels and Williams, they're trying to, extend plays, and we kind of want people to do that, so that's something to keep in mind as well.
And then on the Penix pressure to sack rate too, it's like, yes, he avoided the sack, but on his pass attempts when he's getting pressured, I think a lot of the film guys are like, he looks like he's kind of lost when he gets pressured. He's not very good. And then a lot of the PFF ratings, if I remember correctly, are not very good when he's pressured. So yes, he's avoiding sacks, but is he, with that sack avoidance, doing something that's benefiting his team? And it doesn't really seem like it, both from the analytics and the film. Like it seems like he's kind of lost after that. So you can't just anchor to that one data point and say that he's really good against pressure, because it doesn't seem like he is. Yes, he's avoiding the sack, which is great, but he's also not putting his team into a better situation because of it.
I remember looking at when I was writing the article for Drake May, looking into that, and I think he's in a similar ballpark with either Williams or Daniels. I forget.
A lot of these guys are pretty high relative to history. Daniels, Caleb, and May. I think McCarthy, if I remember, is like a little bit better, but really like it's like Penix is 99th percentile, so he's like all the way on the other end, and then these guys are kind of mostly in the like 20th percentile, so like bad, but with context. But where Caleb really is an outlier is his time to throw. His time to throw is, I think, like 100th percentile, where he holds it, and like it's way longer than basically anyone else that I think I've seen. But like you said, do we want that? Is he trying to, he's putting that like superhero cape on and is trying to put the team on his back, especially that last season in USC. Like, how much of that do you try to beat out of him?
I don't want him to do it that much, but there's something to be said for, I got a crappy offensive line, my weapons are meh, the defense is like historically bad, then I have to score 40 points a game. Like, I'm going to play some hero ball. I think what they've built in Chicago is already like preemptively going to be guardrails for him, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think another factor into that and is competition they played against, because Penix played in the Pac-12. There's only one defense that's even close to being good in that division. It's Oregon. And, I mean, watching him play UGA, I mean, he was getting pressured in his face. He was making horrible throws. There were people open. He was just missing them because there were people around him. And I think it's going to be more like that in the NFL than it will be where you have a clean pocket and you can just throw a quick slant or a quick screen pass to somebody and not have to worry about it. So I think that's important also.
Yeah, it's funny because like I want to give a guy a break. That like, hey, look, anybody can have a bad day, a bad game. If I was judged on my worst performance on anything, it wouldn't be good. But also that Michigan game is probably the closest that he's going to see to an NFL defense, and he didn't look comfortable in that game. And I know that's vibesy. I know that's like whatever, but like that to me that kind of counts.
I think you can. What I found looking more into Penix was that I liked Rome more, learning more about Penix and seeing kind of where he missed, and even like seeing Matt Harmon stuff on Rome. It's like, okay, and it's probably true for a lot of guys like Worthy too, but getting like if he had competent quarterback play consistently, what his production could have been with that too. And I think Rome is a guy that like actually is better at separating than a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing, but he just wasn't put into a situation where he could take advantage of it all of the time.
Yeah, I mean, and Penix had 3 receivers who are going to contribute in the NFL. Yeah. I mean, Brendan Rice is fine at USC, but he can't really separate. So, I mean, Notre Dame, they had a top 5 defense, and Caleb Williams did all he could. He played a really good game, but that team was just not good. And I think that needs to be baked into the factor. Like, he was they had to score 35, 40 points a game to win, and it hopefully won't be like that in Chicago. So.
Maybe he will be the first Chicago 4,000-yard passer. Who knows, right? Anything else you want to say? Anything that stood out to you while you were looking through the numbers, like a guy that seems fugazi based on your numbers, or a guy that you were intrigued by like maybe he doesn't fit in any of these statements we can make about buckets and things like that, but where you say, oh, people like this guy, but I saw this number that says he's, or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, and like I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I really, really like Xavier Worthy. Really, really, really like him. And part of that is that I don't have his weight in there. I know he's 165 pounds. It's really small. But yeah, like with Sean Siegel saying like he's putting Xavier Worthy at wide receiver 3, I have him at 4, but like I can kind of see it. And I feel like that's way higher than most people have Worthy. So Worthy and Franklin, guys that I love, but I don't care about their weight. And if you do care about their weight, then obviously you're going to knock them a little bit more. But yeah, for me, Xavier Worthy and Troy Franklin are 4 and 5 for me on wide receiver rankings, and would be willing to move them up maybe another spot if I was able to. But
yeah, I've kind of gone back and forth on Franklin more than Worthy. Worthy's kind of been my 4 since the beginning, and really I think his ceiling is potentially higher than Odunze. I just know like when I'm balancing floor and ceiling combo, and when I'm balancing like number of NFL teams he can fit into, I'm gonna give the nod to Rome, and especially if I'm gonna be, if we call this dispensing advice, right? I would have to take that into account too. What I'm telling people, but I love Worthy.
Yeah, I think kind of like what Josh said earlier, where you can look at some of the stats that maybe a guy's underperforming, where if something happens to go right the next time, then he's going to start putting up more fantasy points. I think air yards is a really big one, and Worthy led, I think, all of college in 2022 in air yards. So imagine if some of those throws from Ewers were a little bit better. And I know I don't make that same argument for AD Mitchell, but I will make it for Worthy, which is maybe a little inconsistent. But yeah, imagine a scenario where some of those targets were a little bit more close to where Worthy actually was in the field, and how big his production could have been, because the production was fantastic already, but imagine what it would have looked like with a little bit more on target percentage over the last couple of years.
I mean, air yards is one of the main reasons I never gave up on Drake London and Kyle Pitts, because I'm a Falcons fan, so I watch all the games. I mean, they're running good routes, they're open, but the quarterback play is just horrible. So air yards is important.
Oh yeah, I agree. Like I'm still a truther on both those guys. So yeah, we'll see.
Especially London. Yeah, I think I have London in every single dynasty league. There's a couple guys that I have like 100% exposure to. Anthony Richardson and Drake London, I think, are the 2 where I just have them in every league.
That's good.
Yeah.
I wonder what people would be thinking about Hollywood Brown these days if some of those prayer yards he was getting, especially this season when he was relatively healthy, from non-Kyler quarterbacks, right? If some of those turned out to be completions instead of prayer yards, like how the dynasty community would be thinking about Hollywood Brown too.
And he shows up as a comp for Worthy too. I don't think they're the same exact player, but like in terms of, and what's funny is that my stuff doesn't take into account size. I'm just looking at production in college and draft capital and seeing what guys are actually pretty close. And I thought that was kind of a fun one for him. Similar to like my comp for Braylon Allen is AJ Dillon. Not looking at size at all, but I feel like they actually look kind of similar.
He's got AJ Dillon in his range of outcomes for sure.
I think I feels like that is the most likely range of outcome for him and what I've seen. But
well, we're all about to be wrong about a lot soon enough, So we'll
this. You can speak for yourself.
All this Braylon Allen slander and Worthy propaganda is going to bite me in the ass in like a month. We'll see. But as far as robots and smart machines and stuff go, I'm putting a link in the YouTube chat here too. So my boys Fish are playing 4 nights at the Sphere in Las Vegas. Starting in a few days, right? The 18th to the 21st, right? So I found out today from folks who have been there already that in the lobby of the Sphere, they have these robots that like are really smart AI that have like conversations with people about like, why'd you come to Vegas and blah, blah. And so, if you want to see where people like Steven are taking us in the future, it's a link there in the YouTube chat for Aura, the robots at the Las Vegas Sphere.
That's funny.
Don't feed the tulpa.
What's that?
Nothing.
Sweet what?
It's like just don't even indulge the AI. Just don't feed the tulpa.
Yeah.
It's like a saying. Look up tulpas.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna have to Google that. You're gonna have to spell it for me. I'm old, right?
I got you.
I thought you said Dulce de something, and I was like, what?
Were you in dessert?
Dulce de leche. Yep.
Yeah. What's the? There's a God in the machine. No. Deus ex machina is actually the God out from the machine or something. It comes from Greek plays, from where it's a plot device where out of nowhere there would be this like intervention from a god. And when they were performing these plays in person, it was a machine that would like hoist the god up and stuff like that. So Deus ex machina is an intervention by the god machine. So all right, Ghost in the Machine. That's what I was thinking of. Yeah, that's a phrase too. So, yeah, I forget where that comes from. But anyway, wherever the machine is, rage against it, and you're with me. So, time to land the plane on all this. Please make sure you subscribe, rate, review on the Going for Two Live audio podcast feed. If you're watching here on YouTube or other video platforms, do all those other things that feed the algorithm monster, like subscribe. Like notifications and all that jazz. Time for plugs. Steven, remind us where we can find you and your work, and plug your own show more than my Lad McConkey articles, please.
So I'm trying to tweet more. Pretty bad at it. At Target Shares on Twitter. Please follow me. I'll put fun data stuff if you're into any of this that you heard. That's pretty much the stuff that I'll be tweeting out. So writing articles Going for Two, but obviously I'll tweet those out as well. And then the Dynasty Gambit every other Thursday. Me. Gator J, Vandy grad, talking ball. So please join us there. 7:30 p.m. Central, I believe, every other Thursday.
All right. Well, and don't worry, there are way too many people who are too good at tweeting. So not being good at tweeting is probably a good thing these days. Josh, where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Rotonaut, ROTONAUT. I'm about to go through and do an audit on my rankings, go through each player and redo them. I haven't done it. I want to do it once before the draft and then once after, especially rookie rankings. You can find all that at goingfor2.com. When I get it done, I will tweet it out. You can find us in the Discord. We have a Saturday Night 5 little channel. So if you disagree with us, come let us know. We'll talk. We can talk ball. I think that's it. I don't really do much.
You can find me at ffjunkie_ on Twitter. Articles and rankings on goingfor2.com. Been doing some rookie profiles, as Steve alluded to. Next one up is our friend Jaden Daniels that we just talked about. You can also find me on the Dynasty Fever podcast at Dynasty Fever Pod. I do that with Jesse from DWZ. It's not every week. It's more based on our life schedules, but it's more of a long form, like hour and a half conversation that you can listen to in chunks or on 1.25x if you need to. The way that I sell it is, I don't know, I'm trying to sell it a lot of ways because I think we're good and I think people should listen. I'm not trying to make money when I say sell. If you tuned into two friends who absolutely love Dynasty Fantasy Football and they had a conversation, you'd be a fly on the wall for that conversation. I think we do a pretty good job there. Also, again, plug the Discord. It's great. It's got a lot of channels. It's free. It's going to start running Scott Fishbowl mocks, like more than you can handle soon enough. And I have to keep saying, since it was pointed out the other night by Troy, I've pretty much never had a negative interaction on that Discord. And I can't say that about so many spaces in fantasy football today. So
that's a good point. Yeah.
I want to do that. That'll do it. That's a wrap. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.
Go Braves.